Wind's energy to help energize the grid, but at what cost? Wind turbines generate that energy, and there's a crowd who scream, no, not in my backyard, and not in Lake Michigan. We discuss the pros and cons of West Michigan wind energy produced from offshore wind farms on West Michigan Week. Thank you for joining us on West Michigan Week. On the panel, flying solo, is Pete Daly with the Grand Rapids Business Journal.
Patrick,
thanks for joining us. Thanks for being back on the show. And we have Eric Nordman, who is a Grand Valley State University professor. You specialize in biology, and you have been conducting this long-term, all-inclusive report. It's a survey, it's a study, call it whatever you want. But it's important for everybody who is involved in this debate, and you're nearing the end of this, and you've been parceling it out over the last year or so. It's great to read, it's in-depth. Where do you begin? What is the overall message?
So, well, I'll tell you a little bit about our project. We have a team of researchers from the Annis Water Resources Institute and the Seidman College of Business, and myself. We're working on an integrated assessment of wind energy in Michigan's coastal zone, and we're looking at a 4-county area of West Michigan. The project is sponsored by Michigan Sea Grant, which is a coastal management agency, and yeah, we're looking at the benefits and challenges of offshore and onshore wind in environmental, social, technical, and economic dimensions.
And what are those counties?
I was just about to ask that. Yeah.
We're looking at Allegan, Ottawa, Muskegon, and Oceana counties.
Okay.
So just a 4-county area of West Michigan.
And that's, you're staying close to home, and it's really about which way the winds blow, where are they strongest, and what are you finding? I mean, just as a base here, when you're looking at wind and where you're going to get the best bang for your buck, where do you look first?
Well, we started looking at trends around the world. Where has wind energy been deployed, both in foreign countries and here in the United States? We took some of those lessons back and applied them for the West Michigan audience. The wind resource is pretty strong right along the coast, which is great. You know, it's an opportunity to generate some electricity, but it does introduce some challenges as well. We have sensitive coastal environments, and tourism is a concern.
Well, what about offshore? Is the wind stronger offshore in Lake Michigan?
Yes, that's one of the big advantages of moving offshore, is that the wind it's stronger, it's more consistent, and you don't have any turbulence. So onshore winds can be affected by trees, houses, buildings, and that causes turbulence. So the quality of the wind is better in the offshore environment.
Well, I understand they had some turbulence in Pentwater, however, with their opposition to that proposal last year.
That's right. Right in the middle of our project, there was a proposal to put in an offshore wind farm. Various configurations. It ranged from 500 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts off the shore of Pentwater, and then later they moved it down to the Ottawa, Muskegon County area. And that did cause a lot of upheaval in the community.
I just wonder how large a population segment up there was really opposed, or is it just a core group in Pentwater, or do you think it's across the board up there?
I haven't surveyed the community. I can't really give you a firm answer on that. I did attend some of the meetings in the community, and there
are a lot of people there?
There were a lot of people there, and there was a range of opinions were expressed. Some were in support of it, some had some concerns. Some thought that specific project was inappropriate, and maybe we were open to offshore wind energy in general, which is not this time.
And it's not just Pentwater. You know, if you travel through, you can go into Ottawa County, you can go into parts of Allegan. That portion of the population, really from Grand Haven south, and you'll see the yard signs that are out. I mean, basically, it's not in my backyard. Is a lot of that aesthetics? I mean, I know that this is part of the study. It's hey, what's in my backyard? Do I want to look at it? What is the reality as we take a look at that? And we'll get into the transmission and everything else, because there is so much to this topic. But just from the hey, I live here, I pay my taxes, I don't know that I want that. And
we're
there are
talking,
concerns.
we're talking offshore.
Offshore,
mostly,
yeah.
How far out, though?
It's unclear at this point what an actual project that gets permitted would be the distance. The current thinking is it would probably be 6 miles offshore at least. That's what the Michigan Great Lakes Offshore Wind Council, the GLOW Council, used as their mapping criteria last year when they put together their wind resource areas, their priority zones. So probably it would be 6 miles is a good rule of thumb.
But you'll be able to see that because these are large.
Yes. Offshore wind turbines are larger than the ones on land, and they would probably be about 500 feet tall with the blade fully extended. Now, they're skinny, but they would be able, they're not going to disappear over the horizon.
No, but I mean, aren't they going to be minuscule? I mean, I think of the big sailboats that are a mile off, you know, and they don't look that big at a mile.
At 6 miles, a 500-foot tall wind turbine would be about the size of your thumbnail on the horizon if you hold it up.
And these are large European communities, and there's some video here. Are they embracing offshore? So you said you've been in Europe, you've been studying there.
Right.
What's the tone in Europe?
So initially there was a lot of concern about the impacts to the communities in places like Denmark that were early adopters of offshore wind farms. However, recent surveys have shown that the level of acceptance is very high in places like Denmark, and they're second in the world in terms of offshore installation. About 75 to 85% of residents of Denmark, even in coastal communities, approve of offshore wind farms, and they also support more offshore wind energy development. It should be said that Denmark has pretty much maxed out its onshore wind energy capacity. So if they're going to deploy more wind resources, it has to be offshore.
Now, the people that were opposed in Denmark originally, was that for aesthetic reasons, or was that more for environmental?
People tend to oppose wind projects for a number of reasons. Some of it is aesthetics, some of it is concerns about the environmental impacts or noise or what it might do to tourism or property values. But in terms of offshore, just in general, people come to the coast with different expectations and expecting different experiences. So people that live on the coast might choose to live there or vacation there for the aesthetic vistas, the scenic vistas. You know, they might own a business, a charter boat fisherman, so they're concerned about the economic opportunities that the coast provides. So there are, you know, industrial areas that require ports and things like that. So people come to the shore with a variety of expectations, and that really makes the coastal setting ripe for lots of conflicts. And that's something that Robert Thompson at the University of Rhode Island has written a lot about.
Are there health concerns? You hear about that there's a high frequency sound that is made. Is that urban legend, or is there truth to some of that?
That is a very hot topic, we'll say. So wind turbines, whether onshore or offshore, they do make noise. They make a swooshing noise. It's not generally what people would consider loud. It is in the range of 45 decibels. The state of Michigan recommended a zoning ordinance set at 55 decibels. To put that in perspective, the typical suburb background noise is about 45 decibels. So in terms of loudness, they're not really loud, but if you live near one 24 hours a day, that it could be annoying. And some surveys have been done and found that a small minority of people that live near wind farms, much less than 10%, are annoyed by the sound.
I had the opportunity a few years ago to visit the Thumb and the regions there where a number of these farms are in place. You know, I don't want to get too, you know, interject too much of my opinion here, but just from a few hours there. You drive in and you go, oh, this is kind of interesting to look at. There's something about it. I stood underneath one of these giant turbines, and it's a whooshing sound, and I walked away, I thought, when I'm on the beach, the waves on the beach are louder than this.
Yeah, they might mask it, actually.
That's right. On the windiest days, when those turbines will be spinning, and we're talking about on land right now, when they're spinning the fastest, generating the most electricity, there's a lot of background noise. You have rustling leaves and grass and corn stalks, and so there's a lot of background noise that usually masks the sound of the turbine.
You know, as far as offshore, early on when I was doing research on that, the realization that the people that are offshore would be affected if anyone's going to be. And so I figured, well, that's got to be charter boat fishermen, you know, charter boat captains. They make a living out there all summer long. Did you survey any charter boat captains?
We did a project called the Delphi Inquiry, where we facilitated a focus group, several focus groups in different counties along the lakeshore, and we invited charter boat captains to be a part of that, along with other tourism owners, like hotel owners, government officials, engineers, environmental advocates, members of power, the opposition group, and we tried to find out, what were their key concerns. And in terms of the fishing industry, that the fishermen do tend to be concerned about the impacts of offshore wind. We're writing up an issue brief right now on some of those impacts in terms of navigation out on the water. And the Coast Guard will make a determination of proper setbacks. There's no precedent for any sort of exclusion zone in which you wouldn't be able to enter. They do have a safety zone during the construction period, so charter boat fishermen or recreational boaters wouldn't be able to enter a construction zone. But once the turbine's in operation, there's no precedent for excluding people from the area. And the turbines are about half a mile apart, so it's fairly easy to navigate even with a very large vessel carrying coal, for example, to one of the coastal power plants.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the economic impacts in just 1 minute. And we're back. We're discussing the West Michigan Wind Assessment Project that Eric Nordman has been a part of. So many times it's about economics and what's in it for the communities that are involved, what's in it for the corporations who are behind these projects. As you dig into the numbers and have interviewed just about everybody involved, what are the economic pros and cons of offshore wind?
There are a number of pros and cons for wind energy in general and offshore wind in particular. Some of the benefits for offshore wind is that the wind resource is better, so you're going to get more electricity production. But on the cost side, there is you have to have a large, more infrastructure. You have to have a monopile, in the offshore environment.
Sure,
you have to have
anchor it and all that.
Right, usually a monopile foundation, which is a steel tube that's pounded into the sediment, or alternatively a gravity base foundation, which is a big cement structure under the water.
So it's much more expensive to build offshore.
It's about twice as expensive to build a similar size turbine offshore versus onshore. So you've got to do the cost-benefit calculations to determine whether the wind resource, the better quality wind, and the enhanced electricity generation offsets the increased, not only construction costs, but also operation and maintenance costs go up. When you're 6 miles offshore, you've got to get your crews out there for regular maintenance. That takes time. There are windows where the seas are calm that you can get out there.
Hey, Eric, how many people would work on a turbine doing maintenance year-round? I mean, would that employ...
Have you ever figured that out, or?
We looked at the Cape Wind project over in Massachusetts for that. As part of the permitting process, they were required to submit an environmental impact statement, which incorporated some of the economic concerns as well. That's a 420 megawatt project, which is a pretty big project. They anticipate employing during the construction phase somewhere between 500 and 1,000 employees during a 2-year construction phase. After that, once everything's up and running, they expect to employ about 50 people to service the
For the whole
turbines.
farm?
For the whole farm.
Wow.
Talk about that project, because there's been so much debate that's been swirling around this project. Is it a go at this point? What is taking place? And let the viewer know exactly the area we're talking about.
Sure.
This is an East Coast project.
Right. Right now, there are no constructed offshore wind farms anywhere in North America. Everything is either in Europe, and there's one offshore wind farm in China and one small one in Japan. And that's it. Nothing in North America. So 9 years ago, a developer proposed the idea of putting in an offshore wind farm in Nantucket Sound, off the south coast of Cape Cod between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Island.
And this is the one that Ted Kennedy was opposed to.
That's right. So 9 years ago, this has been going on. They still haven't stuck a shovel in the ground in terms of construction. There's been a lot of controversy, but last year they did get a permit, so they filed their environmental impact statement and jumped through lots of other hoops, and they finally got approval. One of the other concerns is about financing. So they do have a buyer for the electricity. That was one of the major things. I think it's National Grid is the utility over there that's going to be purchasing at least part of the power that it generates. They needed to get some financial backing, and I think the most recent news was that the U.S. government declined to provide them with a loan guarantee, but I read yesterday that Siemens, a German company that makes turbines and lots of other industrial components, might step up to provide that financial backing that's necessary. So it's ongoing.
So to put that project in perspective with what we potentially could see here in size and the number of turbines, what are we looking at? And you talk about it's more expensive to put them offshore. What is the upfront cost? What is the benefit coming back when it comes to energizing a grid? I mean, how much energy are we talking about here when you look at people who say, I don't want to see it, but is it worth it? I mean, and I know that's what the study's about,
Right.
and you're kind of hands-off here, but what are we looking at with what goes into it up front, and what do you get out in the end?
The rule of thumb in terms of how much electricity it can generate is, especially, and this is for onshore. So an onshore turbine, the rule of thumb is 1 megawatt can power about 300 homes. So Pete and I were discussing earlier about some of the larger turbines that are being
7, even 10. That's really big. That's the size of a semi-truck, isn't it? Up there on the
yes, it would be.
nacelle would be.
It would be huge. So that one turbine, a 10 megawatt turbine, could provide energy for 3,000 homes, and that's a substantial amount. And one of the benefits of going offshore is that you can put them close to a city where land is scarce. You couldn't put a traditional wind farm close to your demand centers like Boston or New York, but you can do that 6 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. So you're putting the energy where it's going to be needed right away. It avoids some of the transmission congestion, in getting the electricity moving it around.
Isn't there a big hope too that it'll really revive American manufacturing? Is that happening yet? And from what you've seen, I'll mention in a minute some that I've seen, but in your research,
there's a lot of interest in reviving American manufacturing, especially in the Great Lakes area, with offshore wind. The offshore components, as you said, a 10 megawatt machine has an enormous blade, a turbine blade, and that can't be transported by truck or train. It would have to be built fairly close to where it's going to be deployed and then shipped by
Energetics.
Energetics, exactly.
They used to make luxury yachts, or
that's right. They're excellent
well,
example.
they still do actually. But
yeah, just transitioning from
Right.
one line of business to another, and we have so many component manufacturers. But the large pieces really need to be made close to where they're going to be deployed because they're so difficult to transport. And then there are other specialized pieces of equipment like jack-up barges that would have to be manufactured. The vessels themselves would have to be manufactured here in the Great Lakes area because they're too big to get through the St. Lawrence Seaway, for
So that
example.
would revive a shipyard somewhere then.
It's possible.
Huh. There's a company right here in town in Grand Rapids, Betts Industries, and I've been trying to do a story about them for more than a year now for the Business Journal because they either are or they were developing expertise. They're a castings company and trying to get contracts, and I think they were making some progress, but they didn't want to do a story yet. But maybe this will prod them a little bit to come out and if they're having success. And I know there's a lot of smaller companies, metal manufacturing. There's a lot of components that go into those.
A lot of components, and a lot of those components are very similar to what goes into an automobile. So the local companies have some history and expertise in that field.
There's a local alternative energy guru, Brad Callio, who I've spoken with. And he kind of sees things from a different perspective. And he's looked at some of this. And first of all, he says, well, you know what? The blade should turn this way and not this way so you can get more energy. He also talked about harnessing energy from wave motion, that you could have platforms off there and just getting this going, and that way you don't see these large statues out in the middle of the water. Has there been talk of looking at alternative ways to harness the energy that's offshore, or has it been strictly, this is it, this is how we do it?
Strictly wind?
Our project has just been focusing on wind energy and more traditional turbine designs. There are a number of alternative turbine designs that have horizontal axis turbines that spin this way, and even there's a prototype of a very large one that is
It's in the UP, right? I forget what they call that. It looks like an egg beater.
Oh yeah, yep. There are several around the state that have. I think there's one on the way to Detroit. You'll see it at a high school. They have some small vertical axis turbines.
Is there any truth to that? Do they produce more, or is it pretty much?
It depends on the
apples to
location.
apples?
I don't. In terms of the big utility scale, they seem to be all the traditional three-bladed horizontal.
I've heard that I've been told that vertical access design is much quieter, that there's no issue there, but you hear a lot, and it's hard to tell. Hey, I have a question about ice. The big difference between Lake Michigan and Northern Europe, where those offshore farms are now, is they don't really have a major ice issue in the wintertime, which we would have on Lake Michigan. And you get 100 square miles of ice that starts to break up and the wind pushes it. There's huge energy in that, and I wonder if an offshore turbine could withstand that. Has that been studied?
That's an excellent question, and people are working on those kind of engineering challenges. In the Baltic Sea area of Northern Europe, they do have ice on the sea. It's not as thick as what we might experience here in Lake Michigan, for example, but they do have some experience with ice. One way that they handle that is to have an inverted cone shape on the base of the foundation. So when the ice approaches the cone, it breaks off and gets funneled underneath.
Kind of like a cow catcher on a train, huh?
Kind of like that. And then there's another wind farm in Lake Vänern in Sweden. It's a freshwater lake that's been in operation since May of 2010. So that's another opportunity to learn of how they're dealing with ice, and we can, learn lessons and then apply them here.
In the last minute here, you've come a long way on this project. What's left? What's left to work on?
We have a number of issue briefs that we'll be coming out with. Next up is economic development. We have one on navigation for in the offshore environment, for example, with the Coast Guard regulations and also issues with radar. So that's a more technical document, but recreational boaters and pilots might appreciate that. We have 2 environmental issue briefs coming out, one on offshore, one on onshore. And then we have something called the Delphi Inquiry, which I mentioned earlier. I'll be presenting some of that work next week at a conference in Lansing.
Real
Lansing.
quick, Eric, is Muskegon really more in favor of these wind farms than Oceana County? Did we hear that, or is that just one guy?
There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm in the Muskegon area. I can't necessarily.
You want to stay neutral on it.
We got to stay neutral.
We'll get your opinion later.
Okay.
All right. Pete Daly, Grand Rapids Business Journal. Eric Nordman, Professor of Biology, Grand Valley State University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.